afternoon. My name is Noreen Laurinaitis, and I'm the Financial Analyst for the Field Office. I am going to talk this afternoon about procurement standards and procedures for the supportive housing, shelter plus care, or Continuum of Care program. When you're purchasing goods and services for the supportive housing program or Continuum of Care program, it's important to remember that procurement with federal funds places the responsibility on the organization to follow the program rules, approved budget, and other federal requirements. The federal policies and processes for purchasing equipment, supplies, and other items that were identified in the grant's approved budget that will be paid for with federal funds are defined in our OMB circulars A122 and 87, and the regulations are in Title 24, Parts 84 or 85, as they are applicable to your type of organization. These policies and regulations contain the cost principles and administrative requirements to follow when you're using federal funds for your grant programs. You want to be familiar with the federal cost principles in OMB Circular A122 for nonprofit organizations and in OMB Circular A87 for local government. There are three basic principles. Is the expense allowable by the program and by the approved budget? Is the expense reasonable? Would a reasonable person incur this cost at this point in time? And how does it compare to market prices? Is it a sound business practice? And can it be considered an arm's length transaction? And the most important piece is it applicable to the grant being used to pay for the purchases? Can it be assigned to a particular cost objective relative to the benefits received? Now, by that we mean that you will allocate expenses by a particular grant and then by the number of units or participants in the grant. And you want to check your Exhibit 2 budgets to see, to know what you put in the application as the types of items of cost that you are going to fund with this particular grant. You should also be familiar with the administrative requirements for purchases with federal funds, and these regulations include cost principles as well. Nonprofits would file Title 24, Part 84, and local governments would file Title 24, Part 85. You want to make sure that written agreements with any subgrantees contain the regulations that are necessary for their organization type. Parts 84 and Part 85 are very similar, and we've included a crosswalk in your email and also in the handout that gives you the similarities and differences. You can see from the crosswalk that the same requirements, whether a nonprofit or a municipal government or a county government, pretty much follow. In Part 84 for nonprofit procedures, this section establishes the standards for procedures that are required for the purchases of all supplies, equipment, furnishings, and real property. The purchases must be obtained effectively. That means using cost principles, and must be in compliance with all the statutes, the OMB circulars, and Part 84. There is also a property trust relationship in Part 84, and what this means is that property is purchased with federal funds, is held in trust by the recipient. The organization is responsible for any losses, so it implies the need for inventories or real property liens. Part 8536 is the local government requirements. Local governments are allowed to have their own procedures as long as they conform to Part 85, and they must address small purchases, sealed bids, and non-competitive proposals, or the local government must defer back to Part 85. In Part 85 and 84, there are two terms, equipment and supplies. They have very similar definitions, but equipment, whatever is in your organization's procurement policies, these are going to set the standard for what you're going to use in your supportive housing program. So you want to check what you have in your local program procurement policies as to what is defined as a piece of equipment and how those transactions are handled. Equipment in the federal regulations is defined as non-expendable personal property with a useful life of more than 1 year and an acquisition cost of $5,000 or more. However, funded organizations policy can set a lower limit, and when the organization does set a lower limit, this is the limit that's going to apply to your supportive housing or continuum of care program, and this is what we're going to be looking for when we go out to monitor your vouchers. Supplies are defined as all personal property, excluding equipment, intangible property, and debt instruments. You want to remember that all title vests in the organization for equipment and supplies that are purchased with federal funds. You want to keep inventory records that identify grant purchases. You would also want to consider doing an annual physical inventory. You want to store your equipment and supplies in a safe and secure area to avoid losses. Equipment can be used on other programs as long as it does not interfere with the original project. Equipment and supplies must be used solely for authorized purposes, not personal uses. So that means in the case where the federal funds are funding cars, refrigerators, or cell phones, these are used by the grantee staff for the delivery of services, not for their own personal uses. And there are also, within the regulations, requirements for disposition of property purchased with federal funds. You want to check those regulations as to what applies to the property that you are now considering to dispose of. Written procurement procedures are also outlined in Parts 84 and 85. The procedures should be written such that they assist you with avoiding unnecessary purchases. The procedures should address how you will make the least costly, most economical, and practical purchase. And you want to document in your files why a particular product was selected. Your solicitations for products or services should be clear and provide accurate descriptions of the materials, product, or service being purchased. If you can, where it's appropriate, you want to do a lease versus purchase analysis. And documentation of all solicitations must be in the file because your procurement files are going to be selected randomly by HUD staff when they monitor. Your procurement policies also must cover a code of conduct for employees who award or administer federally funded contracts. I think the sample policy we gave you has a clause about code of conduct, and you want to see if you've got something similar in your procurement policies. Your competition must be open and free, and that is required for all purchases made with federal funds. You want to avoid organizational conflicts with contractors and make sure that these are at least an arm's length transaction. If you're going to be doing formal bids because you're exceeding the small purchase threshold, there are requirements in Parts 84 and 5 that have to be followed. You want to award contracts to bidders who are the most advantageous to your organization in price, quality, and other factors. And you want to make sure you're documenting the rationale for how the award was made. If, for example, you are doing awarding a bid based on another factor, you want to make sure you've documented that in the file in case there's problems with bids that are not accepted or awarded. For example, if you had a contractor that was not performing well, you might want to make sure that you've sent him written notice about that poor performance. So if you're going to use that as a justification in the future, you will have documentation of that in your files. Your procurement practice also must address cost and price analysis for all purchases. You want to make sure you're reviewing each element of cost of a product for cost reasonableness. Look at price comparisons, bids, whether or not it's allocable. You want to check the number of units or the number of participants in the grant award, and whether or not the purchase is allowable. That's both in the regulations and in your approved budget, which is your Exhibit 2 budgets. And you also want to document the comparison of price quotes that you received or the market prices that you reviewed to make your decisions. Procurement records, when you are following a formal procurement process for all transactions that exceed the small purchase threshold, you want to make sure you're documenting this process. Small purchases are defined in the federal regulations as $100,000 or more. However, if your procurement policies have a lower dollar threshold, that is what we are going to hold you to in your supportive housing purchases. Your records and files must include documentation of the whole bid process, the basis for the bid or proposal that was selected, the basis for the award cost or the price paid, justification if there was a non-competitive selection, you want to have some justification for that in the file. And if for any reason you need to purchase something that is only available through a sole source, you want to make sure you contact your CPD rep in advance because we're going to need to look at that before you make the purchase. You also need to have, make sure you have internal controls on your purchase transactions, and that must show that your organization has effective control and accountability for all your real and personal property and assets. So that means essentially having inventory records and having your equipment and other items stored in secure locations. And one last aspect is budget control. We want to make sure that you have financial documentation in your files. Copies of backup invoices, copies of the grant budget would help you to identify those items that you are eligible to be purchased with the grant. You want to show within your files and your backup invoices the performance or the productivity data. So that means the number of units or the number of participants that you're purchasing these supplies or equipment for. And finally, where possible, identify the used unit cost information for large purchases of supplies or equipment. So if you're purchasing 12 sofas for a supportive housing program, you want to be able to show where those 12 sofas went and identify the units that they were assigned to and keep property records on those. One last final point I want to make is we remind you to encourage small, women-owned and minority-owned businesses to participate in your supportive housing continuum of care programs. And
let's take some questions from any questions here in the field. One question, Grant.
There's a reference to HUD field audits. Could someone discuss the implications of an agency that's under a federal single audit act annual audit, and how HUD, what is the interface between that and HUD's field audit if you do one?
If you expend more than $500,000 a year in federal funds, you are subject to an A133 audit. I follow those audits in the Federal Clearinghouse, so whenever there is a finding, you will be contacted from the field office in writing, asking to explain, what the corrective actions are that you are taking, and we're going to either agree with it or disagree with those corrective actions, and then we're going to keep following this to resolution.
So if the latest audit has no findings, does that mean there won't be a field audit by HUD?
That's correct.
Okay.
And you also have to upload those audits into the Federal Clearinghouse after you have received them from your auditor.
But then also that does not negate you from us coming down and monitoring you and from a financial perspective and finding some findings and then requiring a corrective action. So,
well, that seems to be contradictory.
From a programmatic perspective. I mean,
it's a program audit, not a financial audit.
Right.
Yeah, I think we should be clear that the A133 audit, the auditor is looking at a certain subset of your accounting records. When we come out to monitor, we're going to be looking at a larger universe.